The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today we meet to consider H.R. 2809, the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2017. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2809, the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2017, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2809, a bill to amend Title 51 United States Code to provide for the authorization and supervision of non-governmental space activities and for other purposes.
And without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. H.R. 2809 establishes a legal and policy environment intended to unleash American free enterprise and business, assure conformity with outer space treaty obligations, and ensure that the United States will lead the world in commercial space activities throughout the 21st century. This bill will promote investment and innovation, resulting in the creation of new, high-paying and high-value jobs across the country. It will increase American competitiveness and attract companies, talent, and money that otherwise would have gone to other countries. It ensures America and its workforce will benefit from the new space economy. The problem this bill seeks to address is the kind of legal uncertainty that arose after Bigelow Aerospace and Moon Express sought payload approval from the Department of Transportation for its non-traditional space activities. The payload review and approval process is meant to prevent launches of payloads that jeopardize American interest and safety. It is not designed to satisfy the State Department's concerns about complying with Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. Under the treaty, signatories are to authorize and provide continuing supervision of their country's non-governmental space activities. In the case of Bigelow and Moon Express, the executive branch stated that it would not be able to assure the public that new and innovative space activities would be approved for launch in the future. The goal of this bill is not to regulate space broadly or to address all of the possible future challenges that the private sector will face in outer space. Doing so would be premature and likely to stifle innovation and investment. Instead, the bill takes a common-sense approach by establishing a legal foundation upon which U.S. industry can flourish. It establishes a transparent U.S. authorization and supervision certification process for non-governmental space activities that provides regulatory certainty for the U.S. commercial space sector. It assures compliance with United States Outer Space Treaty obligations and addresses national security concerns in the least burdensome manner possible. The bill includes a provision that consolidates at the Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce existing regulatory authority spread across 3 different federal agencies now. America gets a one-stop shop for authorizing activities that will take place in outer space. It also streamlines remote sensing regulations to ensure that United States national security is addressed not by holding America's space industry back, but by empowering it to lead the world. Absent this bill, American industry would continue to face legal uncertainty. Innovation would be subject to a burdensome and open-ended regulatory process with no assurance of outer space treaty compliance. An initial draft of the legislation before us now was publicly presented over a month ago for any and all input. We have spent the past month meeting, listening, and considering specific, detailed comments from outside stakeholders, interested federal agencies, the administration, and our committee colleagues, including those from the minority side of the committee. Many, if not most, of their recommendations and requested changes have been included. Over the past few days, we have received letters and statements of support for the bill from the following entities: Agile Aero, Inc., Atmospheric and Environmental Research, Atmospheric and Space Technology Research, Axiom Space, Bigelow Aerospace, Blue Origin, Carmel Research Center, the Commercial Space Flight Federation, consists of hundreds of members, Digital Globe, Geo Optics, Moon Express, Panasonic, Platin Labs, Inc., Satellite Industry Association, Space Frontier Foundation, Spaceport Strategy, Spire Global, Space Environmental Technologies, Space Florida, SpaceX, students from the Exploration and Development of Space and Tech Freedom. Without objection, the letters we have received will be included in the record. And I want to thank these groups for their support of the legislation. Space Subcommittee Chairman Brian Babin and Representative Jim Bridenstine are co-authors and original co-sponsors of the bill. They both have worked diligently for several years to advance this legislation. I'm also glad to have Representative Perlmutter and former Science Committee member Derek Kilmer as original co-sponsors, too. It speaks to the hard work of all committee members and staff in developing this common-sense, bipartisan regulatory reform bill. This transformative, groundbreaking legislation declares in word and intent that America is open for business in space. I strongly recommend this bill and urge my colleagues to support it. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you for holding the hearing for today's markup of H.R. 2809, the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2017. I want to also thank you for delaying it so that we could attempt to work together. That is much appreciated. The issues that this bill attempts to address are important and need to be addressed. Unfortunately, I think the solutions provided in H.R. 2809 may cause more problems than they solve. For this reason, I cannot support the bill in its current form. I think there is a bipartisan agreement concerning the problems being addressed at today's markup. There is a regulatory gap in our current structure of oversight over commercial space activities. We currently regulate launch and re-entry activities, Earth imaging, and space communications. But other and in-orbit or deep space operations are essentially unregulated. I think it is widely acknowledged that these orbital activities need to be more closely overseen, especially as the problem of space debris have increased. The other problem addressed by H.R. 2809 is in the area of commercial remote sensing. Again, I think there is bipartisan agreement that this subject needs to be addressed. U.S. companies are increasingly at a competitive disadvantage versus their foreign competitors due to the current regulatory and oversight situation in the United States in the area of commercial remote sensing. Clearly, something needs to be done here to align our oversight system to the realities of the global marketplace. Unfortunately, the approach the majority has taken in H.R. 2809 may cause more problems than it fixes. For instance, instead of housing Space Regulatory Authority at an agency with existing expertise and existing space regulatory activities, H.R. 2809 would essentially create an entirely new bureaucracy to implement this law. The office that this bill assigns these responsibilities to has a total of 3 full-time employees right now. This makes no sense to me, and it makes no sense to many of the stakeholder community. We have an existing space regulatory body created by the Science Committee and housed by the Department of Transportation, which has the base of expertise to implement this law. I think it makes much more sense to place these new responsibilities within this existing office rather than to create an entirely new and different regulatory body in a different department of the government. Likewise, with regard to commercial remote sensing, this bill takes an unnecessarily expansive approach to addressing the problem. The underlying bill would make the Secretary of Commerce the judge, jury, and executioner with regard to national security issues raised in the commercial remote sensing regulatory process. This is a dramatic turn away from the interagency process that has historically been used to address national security issues in space. Again, instead of improving the process for commercial remote sensing, this bill blows up that process. I think a more incremental improvement to the process would be more constructive. And I think we should acknowledge the reality that the approach this bill takes with regard to national security issues and international obligations will likely doom any chance for enactment of this legislation. There are numerous other issues, both large and small, with this legislation. Many of these issues have been pointed out by the stakeholder community, both in government and in industry. I think if those stakeholders had been consulted prior to drafting this legislation, rather than as an afterthought, we could have avoided these problems entirely. We have good staff here on the committee. For instance, my aerospace staff have over 100 years of combined experience working on these issues in government, industry, and NGOs. Nevertheless, even with their wealth of experience and expertise, I wouldn't want them to craft complex legislation without first consulting the full cross-section of the affected stakeholder community. Result of not consulting with that stakeholder community from the outset is that we have a bill before us today that is needlessly complex, unsupported by broad swaths of the government and industry, and very unlikely to be enacted into law. Mr. Chairman, I applaud your efforts to address two very real problems with our commercial space regulatory regime. However, I think we'd be better served by hitting the reset button on this legislation. I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The chairman of the Space Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Good morning or good afternoon. I wanted to say that I strongly support H.R. 2809, the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2017. I'm grateful to have worked with Chairman Smith and Representative Bridenstine in the development of this bill. I'm also very glad that this is a bipartisan bill with the support of Representatives Perlmutter and Kilmer. The American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act is a common-sense bipartisan bill that streamlines the regulatory processes. It limits burdensome government intrusion, promotes American innovation and investment, protects national security, and satisfies our international obligations. One of the fundamental drivers for this legislation has been that innovative American companies are pushing the boundaries. When the Senate ratified the Outer Space Treaty 50 years ago, free enterprise in outer space was an idea, but not yet a reality. Today, not only does the U.S. free enterprise exist in outer space, it is innovating at an unprecedented pace. From asteroid mining to private moon missions, satellite servicing to remote sensing constellations, there is great promise that American enterprise will soon unlock new wealth and scientific benefits. But this promise is threatened by expansive, unchecked regulatory authority, cumbersome, non-transparent regulatory processes, and misperceptions about the United States outer space treaty obligations. For several years, the Space Subcommittee has heard concerns from our stakeholders that they need greater regulatory certainty to attract investment and to succeed. Stakeholders also reported that while they want to stay in America, due to U.S. federal regulatory burdens and uncertainty, they might need to go overseas. The American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act addresses these concerns without compromising our cherished principles of liberty. It provides for presumptions of approval and requires the government to take affirmative steps before conditioning or denying proposed space or remote sensing operations. It places the burden of demonstrating inconsistency with outer space treaty obligations and national security requirements of the United States with the government and not with the applicant. It curtails vague, overreaching regulatory authority and prevents tolling of statutory adjudication timelines. It ensures U.S. industry receives a timely and transparent determination on applications. The bill recognizes legitimate national security equities and provides for the condition or denial of authorized space activities with remote sensing systems that are a significant threat to U.S. national security in certain circumstances. But it protects against abuses of interagency discretion by requiring an explanation and evidence of the threat before conditions or denial can be made. In order to ensure the Office of Space Commerce is empowered to represent the interests of our citizens and the private sector, the Director of the Office of Space Commerce is elevated to be the Assistant Secretary for Space Commerce. The Act also advances important public policy interests. The bill establishes a mandatory safety consultation between private and federal government operators. The goal of this consultation is for the affected parties to reach a voluntary agreement to mitigate safety risks. For parties subject to U.S. jurisdiction, the Act provides for federal district court jurisdiction for any civil action resulting from certified or permitted space operations. To protect against foreign harmful interference, the Act directs the President to protect against acts of foreign aggression and foreign harmful interference. The Act also addresses concerns of harmful contamination of the Earth or of celestial bodies. Pursuant to our international obligations under the Outer Space Treaty, operations may be conditioned or denied by the Secretary of Commerce in consultation with appropriate agencies such as NASA to address harmful contamination. The bill posits long-standing United States policy confirmed by both the Department of State and NASA that COSPAR planetary protection guidelines are not international obligations of the United States. This was done to allow all stakeholders, including the scientific community and industry, to work together as activities expand beyond scientific exploration and use to address our mutual interests, not by proscribing COSPAR guidelines as binding international law, but by allowing the Outer Space Treaty to guide our activities. I strongly support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. And the gentleman from Oklahoma, one of the principal authors of the bill, is recognized for his opening statement. Mr. Bridenstine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For several years now, there has been uncertainty around which government agency has the responsibility to approve non-traditional space activities while ensuring conformity with the Outer Space Treaty. This uncertainty has hurt capital formation and innovation. It also sends American companies scrambling overseas to countries such as Luxembourg and the United Arab Emirates. This is the exact opposite of the environment we need in this country. I have made solving this issue one of my top priorities in Congress. And as the chairman noted, Bigelow Aerospace and Moon Express have been blazing a trail here. Last year, I proposed legislation to provide for an enhanced payload review. The American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act takes from that and builds upon it much of the consensus we gained around the policies in that draft legislation. The American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act provides certainty to industry by granting the ability to approve commercial space activities to a single authority. I want to be clear. We need a single authority. In this case, we've determined that the best case would be the Secretary of Commerce. The Office of Space Commerce will be elevated to a more prominent position within the Commerce Department and will perform a simple review of proposed operations to check that they are not violating the United States obligations under the Outer Space Treaty. This gives the executive branch the tool that it claims that it needs while instituting a clear, known, transparent, and timely process for American industry to prosper. There is discretion built into this bill for the Secretary to condition or even deny a certification. I think this is an important piece to have from a policy standpoint. However, the onus here to prove that there is a problem is now going to be on the government. The message Congress is trying to send is, as the chairman said, that America is open for business, especially in space. However, Congress also recognizes that there are other policies and interests of the United States that are affected by private sector space activities, one of them being national security. As a former naval aviator, a current Oklahoma Air National Guardsman, and a member of the House Armed Services Committee, there is nothing more important to me than national security of the United States. I want to be clear, this bill actually improves the national security of the United States. This is why the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act rolls in remote sensing reform. National security interests for the foreseeable future will require remote sensing systems, many of which are now going to be provided commercially. By requiring a national security risk assessment during the remote sensing system permitting process, we are ensuring national security concerns are met. This has also provided an opportunity in this bill for us to reform the broken system of remote sensing licensing that is overly restrictive, thwarts industry, and hands an advantage to foreign competitors. As the author of Title II of the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015, along with my good friend from Colorado, Ed Perlmutter, I have been committed to fixing this issue for many years. The American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act improves the remote sensing permitting process by creating a single decision point, increasing transparency of the process, avoiding unnecessary reviews of technologies that are available in the free market or that have already been approved, and preventing the interagency process from indefinitely delaying decision-making. These changes will allow our remote sensing industry to once again be the world leader. The bill goes farther than current law to provide for the physical safety of the United States government assets in orbit. After operations are certificated, the government can do an assessment for physical safety issues, and a consultation forum will be held to come to a solution that can prevent any disastrous collisions to protect the safety of government and private assets. This bill will engender a growth in commercial space activity that we have not yet seen in the United States of America. This is a good growth of space activity, but this growth will continue to put further stress on the agency responsible for approving launches, the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. Congress needs to be mindful that we must be proactive on that office as well. And I have an amendment to begin addressing this issue later here in the markup. Mr. Chairman, this is a strong and a very bipartisan bill. This is a good place to begin the legislative process as we work with the rest of our House colleagues, the Senate, and the administration to eventually get a solution put into law. I want to thank you, Chairman Smith, for all of your hard work on this, as well as Chairman Babin. We're sending a clear message here today. I'm proud to support the bill, and I look forward to favorably reporting it out of the Science Committee. I'd also like to thank a couple of the staffers. Christopher Ingram in my office has been working overtime on this. And Mr. Chairman, your staffers, Chris Weidler, Tom Hammond, Mike Monero, and Shanna Dale have been on the phone day in and day out for many, many months now. And thank you for allowing them to work so hard on this bill. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. Appreciate the compliments directed toward staff and the legislation as well. We will now proceed with amendments in the order listed in the roster. And the first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2809, offered by Mr. Smith of Texas, amendment number 012.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I'll recognize myself in support of the manager's amendment. The manager's amendment makes technical corrections and minor changes to the bill. Among these, it extends the time the Secretary of Commerce has to adjudicate certificate and permit applications from 60 to 90 days. The amendment also says that the Secretary of Commerce shall consult, as the Secretary considers necessary, with the heads of other relevant agencies. This change was made to ensure that departments and agencies such as NASA, the Department of Defense, or the Department of State have a way to inform Secretary of Commerce determinations on proposed space activities. However, further modifying the consultation authorities under the bill beyond shall consult as the Secretary considers necessary puts at risk the very purpose of the bill. Additional changes would undermine the ability of the Secretary to provide a fair and equitable adjudication of applications and open up the certification and permitting processes to excessive interagency control. Today, remote sensing systems are subject to a regulatory regime where at least 3 different departments and agencies have the authority to condition or deny applications. As a result, licensing actions occur months and even years over the 120-day determination timeline required by law. Companies are applying and waiting without any understanding as to why NOAA takes so long to get back. Stakeholders report significant uncertainty with licensing actions, including modifications to operational license conditions without notice or due process. American remote sensing startups want to stay in the United States, but must plan for overseas operations due to the uncertainty in our current regulatory approval process. Experience also has taught us that while the Department of Transportation retains exclusive authority to make determinations for international obligations for launch and reentry activities, inflexible consultation provisions have in practice become de facto concurrence authorities for other departments and agencies. This is not to say that the intent of the bill is to undermine the ability of the executive branch to appropriately inform the Secretary of Commerce about remote sensing applications. On the contrary, the proposed amendment will clearly provide such a process. We must also recognize that any major disagreement between the Secretary of Commerce and other departments or agencies regarding a proposed operation will be elevated to the White House for adjudication. In such interagency environments, if we move the needle too far in favor of other agencies, the Secretary of Commerce will not be able to represent the interest of the applicant and the national interest of free enterprise. For all these reasons, I support this amendment, and not only ask my colleagues to do the same, but want to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, and give him credit for these changes as well. Let's see, is there any further discussion on the amendment? The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, and I move to strike the last
The
word.
gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm here today as a supporter and co-sponsor of H.R. 2809. The United States currently has the best aerospace industry in the world. In order to stay number one, we need to provide it certainty so that the industry can attract investment and continue innovating to push our country forward. We also want to help set the standard for how to regulate space activities so there is a level playing field for our American industry. That is why we need a certification process as provided in the bill to ensure compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. I understand there is still some discussion amongst industry and from involved agencies about where this authority should be placed, either within the Office of Space Commerce, as under the bill, or under the Office of Space Transportation at the FAA, or maybe someplace else. I hope this discussion continues and we reach a consensus as we continue through the legislative process. I hope our committee continues to also have the discussion on space traffic management and how to properly protect both U.S. government and other U.S. commercial spacecraft to avoid conflicts and costly problems for everyone. The second part of the bill, and the chairman was just referring to it, makes important reforms for the remote sensing industry. As many of you may know, a major remote sensing company named Digital Globe is headquartered in my district in Westminster, Colorado. I've heard the stories about how long they've waited for a license determination under NOAA, over 3 years and counting in one case. This is well past the 120-day deadline currently required in statute because there is no mechanism to enforce any timeline. This is why I believe the reforms in Section 4 of the bill are overdue and are necessary. Those companies in the business, in the remote sensing business, need certainty so they can make sound plans and attract investors and customers. All of these regulatory delays mean lost revenue and significant expenses fighting for approval. Section 4 of the bill fixes that. I'd like to take a moment and thank Congressman Smith, Babin, and Bridenstine for working with me on this bill. I believe they've made improvements to the text of the bill, including specific consultation language, as the chairman just discussed, which requires consultation with other federal agencies, ensuring proper determinations regarding the Outer Space Treaty, national security, and authorizing funding for the Office of Space Commerce. I'm grateful the sponsors included two provisions I asked for in the manager's amendment. We are extending the deadlines in the bill from 60 days to 90 days to ensure the Office of Space Commerce has the time needed to get its decisions right. Additionally, the amendment strengthens the consultation language to require the Secretary of Commerce to consult with other relevant federal agencies as he deems necessary when making the determinations. For these reasons, I support the bill, and I look forward to continuing to improve it as it goes through the process, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. And the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the subcommittee, is recognized for a statement as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I wish as well to speak in favor of the amendment. One of the changes made by this amendment is extending the time that the Secretary of Commerce has to adjudicate certificate and permit applications from 60 to 90 days. This change is being made after discussions with stakeholders and other members, specifically the minority. I believe this is a reasonable accommodation that will grant the Secretary of Commerce time necessary to properly adjudicate applications without overly burdening the applicant. However, I caution extending this timeline beyond 90 days. The Secretary and the interagency consultation process must be held accountable. Without a firm deadline, experience has shown that the interagency process can lead to long delays in violation of the law. Today, under existing law, remote sensing licenses are required to be adjudicated within 120 days. The reality is that applications have, in some cases, as Mr. Perlmutter mentioned, taken years in clear violation of the law. We cannot repeat this mistake. I also completely agree with the points that Chairman Smith made regarding the consultation language in this amendment. And while changing the consultation from may to shall is a reasonable change to address stakeholder concerns, further modifying the consultation authorities under the bill beyond shall consult as the Secretary considers necessary puts at risk the very purpose of this bill. I support this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Is there any further discussion on the bill? If not, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just be quick. I wanted to thank my friend from Colorado, Ed Perlmutter, because he provided a lot of great input. Same with my friend from California, Mr. Barra, a lot of great input. We have made many efforts to accommodate those changes, and in fact, appreciate Ed for not only, no. Mr. Perlmutter is my enemy. How about that? Does that help you in your primary? No, I appreciate his good faith effort in trying to make this a better bill, and I look forward to working with him in the future to make it even better.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, all in favor of the manager's amendment say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, and she is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at
And
the
the
desk.
clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2809, offered by Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas, amendment number 002.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the ranking member is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you. When I first learned that the chairman wanted to pursue commercial space legislation this spring, I let him know that I wanted to work with him to see whether we could develop a bipartisan piece of legislation that all members could support. Majority and minority staff tried hard to achieve such a result, but ultimately, too many significant issues still remain to be resolved with this bill when today's markup was noticed. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, many concerns were raised about the bill's provisions by NASA, our national security agencies, the State Department, and industry stakeholders, among others. In fact, when NASA reviewed the latest version of the bill we're marking up today, the agency identified even more concerns than were included in its original set of comments. In short, this bill is not a bill that can be fixed with a few cut-and-bite amendments at today's markup. That said, the issues that the bill attempts to address are important ones. I feel an obligation to propose an alternative approach that can address these issues, not just oppose the current bill. And this is what my amendment is intended to do. Fortunately, we already have a roadmap for much of this work. Congress asked for and received guidance from the administration last year regarding certification of innovative new space activities. The legislative proposal represented a consensus of all the agencies that will need to deal with these space systems and ensure they meet our national security and international obligations. Section 3 of my amendment essentially codifies that interagency consensus on mission certification. Among the key features of that consensus approach is a decision to not reinvent the wheel, but instead to leverage the competencies that have been built up in FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation and utilize the existing robust interagency review process. One of the strengths of that interagency process is that it can help provide companies and investors the assurance that an agency will not try to block their proposed activities at the last minute simply because the agency hadn't had an opportunity to review the proposal. As mentioned in my opening statement, that needn't require creating yet another federal bureaucracy with all of the resulting costs and delays that will accompany its creation. In essence, the amendment takes a light touch approach to regulating the emerging non-traditional commercial space systems, rather than requiring page after page of convoluted legislative text. The amendment builds on the highly successful FAA space launch licensing process and provides a clean, straightforward path for the certification of these innovative new space systems. In addition, Section 3 of the amendment is consistent with the consensus approach endorsed by the space professionals of the agencies that will have to deal with these new systems, in marked contrast to the bill being marked up today. With respect to commercial remote sensing licensing, my amendment again attempts to build on an existing process rather than blowing it up and starting over. The amendment proposes a number of reforms that have been urged by the remote sensing industry, including shortened timetables for application reviews, certainty that granting a license means that national security and international obligation concerns have been addressed, an elevation of the remote sensing licensing function at the Commerce Department. Equally importantly, it authorized a significant increase in funding for the office that will be handling these remote sensing licensing applications. It is hard to criticize Commerce for the slowness of its licensing operation when Congress has too often failed to provide the resources and staffing the licensing office needs. In conclusion, the amendment I'm offering today addresses head-on the two issues that we are considering today and takes on an approach that is limited, allows our oversight of these new systems to evolve as we gain more experience, and minimizes the cost and delays that will inevitably be incurred under the approach taken in this base bill. However, I really can count. I learned to count over 75 years ago in Waco, Texas. And I realize that this amendment has very little chance of being adopted. So as I mentioned earlier, I don't think the issues being addressed today are inherently partisan, and it is my hope that we can continue to work together and find a common ground to support all aspects of the commercial space industry. In that light, I'm going to withdraw my amendment and hope that we can continue to work together to reach a consensus on this bill. So I ask consent to withdraw the amendment, and I yield back.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn, and I thank the gentlewoman for her comments. I'm going to recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, not to go in any great detail as I would have had it not been withdrawn, but I do want members of the committee on both sides of the aisle to recognize a little bit about the efforts we have made to try to make this a bipartisan piece of legislation. This committee has worked diligently to ensure that our international obligations and national security interests are met in the least burdensome manner possible. On September 7, 2016, the committee held a hearing titled Commercial Remote Sensing, Facilitating Innovation and Leadership. On March 8, 2017, the committee held a hearing on regulating space, innovation, liberty, and international obligations. We shared a discussion draft of the bill before us today with the minority, stakeholders, and agencies more than a month ago. We participated in dozens of bipartisan meetings with stakeholders and the minority. We incorporated dozens of edits that were responsive to all parties. We circulated an updated version of the draft bill last week, days in advance of what is required by committee rules. The minority requested 11 specific changes to the bill. In the interest of good faith, we accommodated as many as we could, a great majority, in fact. After making all those accommodations to the minority, I was more than disappointed to see this amendment in the nature of a substitute. And while I won't go into all my objections to the amendment, I'll simply say, in general, the ranking member's amendment would strangle an industry in its early stages with burdensome regulations, force companies to relocate overseas, compromise national security, stifle innovation and economic competitiveness, and relegate the United States to a second-rate spacefaring nation. I'll be happy to share my additional objections with members, but in the interest of time, I'll simply say that I am a little bit concerned about the ability of this committee to process bipartisan bills if we can't agree on this piece of legislation that is so widely supported by so many interest groups. And after all the efforts we've made, all the reassurances that we have received, I just hope that all individuals of the committee will make up their own minds and reach their own conclusions as to whether they think this is a good piece of legislation. That concludes my remarks, and we will now go to the third amendment to be offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine.
Stand by 1 second, Chairman.
I don't see where my stuff is.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this bill is intended to engender growth in commercial space activity that will be unlike any we have seen.
Okay, the clerk will report the
Oh,
amendment.
yeah, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 2809, offered by Mr. Bridenstine of Oklahoma, amendment number 008.
Okay, with that objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is intended to engender growth in the commercial space activity that will be unlike any we have seen, granting maximum certainty with minimal regulatory burden to non-traditional activities, as well as improving the process for more traditional activity, will encourage American entrepreneurs and innovators to take risks, to raise capital, and to start new ventures. These endeavors will need to get to space, and they will do so, hopefully, on the top of American rockets. But in order to do that, the office that regulates and promotes the commercial launch industry must be well positioned to carry out this job efficiently and effectively. I have long been a vocal proponent of FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, or sometimes called FAA-AST. I have led the fight to provide it with increased resources and update the regulations under its purview. For this office to truly be effective, however, it cannot be buried within the FAA, where it must compete for resources and it has to compete for focus. It must be moved back to the secretariat level within the Department of Transportation. My amendment is very simple. It calls for a GAO study to assess the pros and cons of moving FAA-AST out of the FAA and to make it an Assistant Secretary of Transportation position, and the issues that would need to be addressed in such a move. While I am a firm believer that this move must be done, I think that we have to have full situational awareness so that we do it right and that our colleagues are comfortable with doing so. Just a few seconds ago, Mr. Webster from Florida asked me how, if we were to privatize FAA, how my amendment would be affected. And the question is a good one, and the answer is, I don't know. I want to make it very clear what this amendment is and what it does. We're just asking the GAO to do a study. If we were to take FAA-AST, move it out of FAA, move it under the Secretary of Transportation, and make the current Associate Administrator of the FAA into an Assistant Secretary of Transportation, that's what this study is getting at. What is it required? What do we need to do to make that happen? And what will the impact be? And of course, the privatization of the FAA is a question that we don't know if that's going to happen yet, number one. And number two, if it does happen, what will happen to AST if that does happen? So Mr. Webster had a great question. Hopefully this study will get us more smart on what that does. So Mr. Chairman, if we don't address the relationship between what we are trying to do in the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act and the FAA-AST, I fear we might be setting FAA-AST up for failure. This amendment is a good first step in a process to support AST. I want to be clear, when I say AST, I'm talking about the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. We want to support that office and move it back up to the Department of Transportation. All this amendment does is it creates a study to see how we would do that, and if we did, what the implications would be. With that, I urge its adoption, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield to me before he yields back?
Yes, sir.
And that is simply so that I can say, I want to thank you for offering the amendment, and I recommend it to my colleagues. It adds to the piece of legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there other members who want to be recognized? The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson.
I just want to say I support that. I think we need that information. I appreciate you bringing it forward.
Okay. The question is on agreeing to the amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. And we will now go to our last amendment, and it's going to be an amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. I can see his hand, and he is recognized. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2809, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number 010.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Sure. Under the bill, there is a committee, Private Space Activity Advisory Committee, that's constituted, and it has among its duties a variety of things. What this amendment does at page 27, line 12, it adds the committee is supposed to also consider our aerospace industry's access to adequate, predictable, and reliable radio frequency spectrum. So to just make sure that spectrum is available to the aerospace industry, and that's all the amendment does. And with that, I yield back.
I'm sorry. Has the gentleman yielded back?
I did.
Okay, thank you for the amendment. I'll recognize myself simply to say I support the amendment and urge my colleagues to support it as well. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Let's see. Let me, we're going to go to final passage. Before he leaves the room, at the risk of hurting him back home, I do want to thank Mr. Perlmutter for substantially improving the legislation, but honestly and seriously, this is a good bipartisan piece of legislation, and we've had others dealing with space. It is a wonderful subject for us to be excited about, and that will inspire others as well. If there are no further amendments, reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 2809 to the House as amended, with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2809 to the House as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. 2809 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you all. This was great attendance today. I appreciate everybody's input, and the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is not intended to be a goodbye to Ms. Perlmutter.
We stand adjourned. Thank you all. Good to get through.